university offer a society that is living in the shadow of existential environmental threats? Dr. Matthew Warren is a lecturer at UCM, but also the co-founder of a social enterprise called Earthscope, which is dedicated to putting people and planet at the heart of the Earth now, launching this month, I believe. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jo. Thank you very much for having me. And I'm going to be talking today more as an independent scholar, someone who's been involved in sociology and philosophy, but my background is in this establishment of social enterprise, Earthscope, which is a new startup coming to an island very, very near you this month. Okay, does anyone know where Hutchinson Square is? Yeah? So, I only visited it for the first time a bit the other day. If you go along the prom and up Broadway in Douglas, then and sort of turn up right, somewhere up there, isn't it? Yeah, you get to Hutchinson Square. If you were passing Hutchinson Square in the summer of 1940, you might be confronted by a slightly curious sight. Men emerging from houses, carrying chairs and dispersing around the public square. Setting the chairs down, they would proceed to climb on top of them, raising them above the gaggles of other men who were gathering around them. Then each one proceeds to deliver an address to the audience. If you tried to go closer, you'd have found your way blocked by either barbed wire or a uniformed soldier with a rifle. And you might ask, what is going on here that I'm not allowed to hear? If you manage to catch a few words from the speakers, you might hear an eclectic bunch of terms from the lexicons of geography, from law, from medieval history, architecture and comparative religion, or words from all of these different areas of study. Could it be some sort of code? This is the middle of World War II. Well, those who are versed in local history will probably be ahead of the game here. To everyone else, all will become clear. First of all, I'm Matthew Warren. I studied ethnomusicology and sociology of higher education at Durham University before I came here to lecture in the music department at UCM and set up Earthscope. And what intrigues me about what we do as lecturers and as researchers is this whole formation of higher education, this whole formation of universities, and it's a massive field. So what I want to do today is get a little way into that, what do universities look like, and ask what's the relationship between what the universities look like, how they know, and the kind of things that the kind of ways in which we can deal with, as Jo said, existential sustainability crises. So what was the scene I just described to you? Well, there is a woodcut here of Hutchinson internment camp. This was where the aliens, so-called, were in one of the sites where aliens were interned during World War II. Now I raise Hutchinson in particular because of this curious scene that you just saw, where people who were interned in that camp started just sort of giving lectures to one another. There were concerts, there were people creating artwork. It was noted for this foment of intellectual activity. Over the first 6 months that Hutchinson internment camp was operating, over 150 lecturers taught more than 600 classes to other internees. No one was paying them. No one was organising it for them. After a little while, after the rather chaotic start you witnessed through that scene, there was more of an organised structure that came into being, but essentially this was a method of trying to lead a fulfilling life under challenging circumstances. Now the point of raising this story to begin with is to highlight something that perhaps we can overlook. If I were to say to you, oh, just go and set up a university, would you? You might have an immediate idea of what that's got to look like. probably maybe dependent on if you went to university, where that was and what that looked like. You'd probably have a pretty clear idea. But my point with raising this is to show that, first of all, there are lots of different forms of a university. What higher learning looks like can change dramatically from place to place. We have a few very dominant forms of higher learning, but that's not necessarily the case. And secondly, as a sociologist, what interests me is that all social formations of any kind, including those of knowledge production, knowledge creation, all come out of a certain set of cultural or societal conditions. In the case of Hutchinson internment camp, or Hutchinson University, or barbed wire universities, it's been written about, what you have are kind of positive and negative conditions that gave rise to this sort of instant, spontaneous university. In terms of positive conditions, the people who were imprisoned here were some of the leading artists, intellectuals, and scholars of their day. Quite a number of Oxford dons, architects, industrialists were imprisoned here because it was essentially indiscriminate. It was a wave of anti-fifth columnist fervour that just involved, as Churchill said, I can't remember the exact quote, but ran them all up, basically. And that resulted in a really diverse collection of people, including an astonishing concentration of academics who had previously largely been fleeing regimes in Germany and Italy. Different forms of the university have been not only enacted and created, but written about in sociological and philosophical literature for many, 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 many centuries. Perhaps the most famous, for those of you who might have read Plato's Republic, would be his idea of this university that creates simple philosopher kings. Here are just a few of them. The scholar Ronald Barnett, who has dedicated all his life to the study of universities and different forms they may take. I think he said at one point he has a list in his office of over 100 different types, ideas of the university. So things like ones we see for us, both things that have been created and lived out, like plate glass universities, that's universities like York and University of East Anglia, sort of 60s universities from the UK, which had a particular mission, particular social conditions, and things that have just kind of been proposed, such as the Ecological University, which is Ronald Barnett's own personal scholarly project. So there are lots of different types of way of thinking about it. But the point of raising the idea that there are social conditions is to first it prompts us to ask, what are the social conditions that would create a particular idea of the university for us? What are the social pressures that we undergo today? In other words, what does the current crisis look like? And I don't feel the need to go into any particular depth because we've had such a wonderful introduction and far more intelligence and scholarly introduction to that than I could manage already this morning. But what I will do is mention that I think the term crisis is important, and this becomes important for the rest of this argument. Crisis was, before it had a more general use, it was a specifically medical term. It's the point at which someone either lives or dies from a disease. It's the critical moment in which fate hangs in the balance, and then you either recover or you don't. That's what a crisis point is for a disease. And that's where this whole term comes from. And I'd say that in the absence of any greater knowledge about the tipping points that exactly when they tip, we have to assume we're living in the moment of crisis, the moment where our actions can shape the uncertain future. In which case, this crisis is our prompting social conditions. And so this leads one, I think, to think about what exactly the factors that lie behind this crisis of sustainability. talk about most crises as crisis of sustainability. Something is either being sustained, i.e. life, or it is fading away and being replaced by something else. A crisis is, in a way, necessarily about sustainability, so this word's not necessarily the most useful. But it's such a huge, vast and complex problem that I'm not going to try and pick out all the aspects I think are important, but I want to focus on just a few sort of social conditions, societal norms, that I don't think are too controversial to highlight. Extraction is one we're going to focus on a lot in this talk, but it's basically talking about taking without replenishing or taking without concern for the place from which something has been taken. And this has been generalised into an idea of extractivism as a philosophical concept, the idea that we have a habit of taking without concern for where something's come from. Then transaction, possessiveness, and individual capital. Again, to put them up there might seem like I'm about to write another communist manifesto, but I don't actually think that's anything that a moderate neoliberal wouldn't agree with. The idea that transaction and possession and individual capital contribute to climate change, well, that's kind of what all regulation is for. It's to mitigate those externalities that the individual who has possession over something doesn't feel or doesn't require to consider in order to maintain the value of their property. So these are all kind of aspects to it, and value calculations are a really interesting one that I don't think I have time to go into, sadly. But maybe we can come back to. So, but with all of these different aspects, I don't maintain that they're different things. These are just kind of a flavour. They add up with a load of other things to a logic of human and natural separation, and I'm so glad you guys brought that in because it saved me a lot of intellectual heavy lifting. This idea that humans are separate from nature and that nature is in some way admissible as a possession. And then Genesis. Well, absolutely. If we're going to get right into it, yeah, definitely. So the associated, and this is to do with the associated rights and ownership over the non-human, and there are interesting scholars who have also said being human isn't actually about your DNA, it's about a social classification, and so extractivism can apply, as in extremists with slavery, to people who are biologically human. They can be classed as nature, or non-human, therefore extractable and exploitable. So the point is that this logic adds up to a system where there's not only freedom to, but an imperative to, for the owners of capital to extract and deplete resources. In other words, our present wealth has literally cost the earth. We can probably imagine, a stereotypical robber baron strip mining for coal to sell energy at a vast profit to the masses. That might be a form of extractivism that we can probably see fairly visually. But what does that really have to do with the university? There are all sorts of practical issues to do with funding divestment, to do with avenues of research. I'm not going to go down a very practical route. For those of you who are here on tips on sustainability policies, I'm going to leave that to those who deal with that for those organisations. What I want to deal with here is a broader philosophical argument about epistemology, that is the way in which we know things, the way in which we construct knowledge. So just as all these factors are not discrete but form interwoven generic logic that's led to the present crisis, knowledge and its construction also interacts with wider societal logics. So focusing on the idea of extractivism, in the second half of this paper I'm going to argue that knowledge production can be viewed in a very similar way to the capitalist production of material goods, and that by following in the philosophy of extractivism, thinkers who are focused on extractivism, an alternative of experimental social organisation in the university can be found not only to counter the unsustainable capitalist value systems, but as a prerequisite for what I contend is the fundamental purpose of the university, which is the act of thinking differently. So we're going to come to this idea that to think differently, one must relate differently to those around, and also to the whole world one must have, and so and there is an epistemic question around the whole question of can we do new thinking. And this reimagination of the university is something that I've written about before and called the liminal university, which is a term I'll continue with. The university today has been kind of generally, it's widely contended by many academics to be in crisis, in a state of crisis, or in a state of flux at very least. Terms like, there's a war on for the future of the university, a writer called Doherty opens this book with. And these, the various critiques that are levelled at the university, certainly in the UK, in North America, and also in Europe, to varying degrees in different bits of the world. It's never all the same. Like I said, there's no one type of university. All these critiques bring up, time and time again, the extension of consumerist or capitalist logic into the field of knowledge creation. We're going to focus on the idea of extractivism, and there are several people who have tried to trace the link between extractivism as a process of physically extracting something from somewhere, causing damage, and just using the value, and the process of extracting knowledge. So can knowledge be extracted? We can certainly trace the parallels between them. The sociologist Ramon, I'm going to butcher his name, so I'm glad he's not here, I'm assuming, Grossvogel, in his article, his essay, Epistemic Extractivism, he comes back to this human nature separation. He says that the notion of nature itself is Eurocentric, Western-centric, and anthropocentric. It's a highly problematic concept since it implies a division between the subject, human, and the object, nature, in which human subject has life and the rest of nature is deemed to constitute inert objects. So again, that's just to retrace this idea that if we treat the rest of the world as if we are the only agent, as the researcher, or as a particular society, then that is the root, Grossvogel thinks, of epistemic extractivism. And this creates a power imbalance. This is fundamental contention. The intellectual, cognitive, or intellectual, cognitive, or epistemic extractivism represents a mentality that does not seek any dialogue that implies an equal horizontal dialogue between people, or any understanding of indigenous knowledge on its own terms, but instead aims to extract ideas, to colonize them, subsuming them within Western cultural parameters and episteme. Epistemic extractivism extracts ideas, whether scientific or environmentalist, from indigenous communities, removing them from the context in which they were produced to depoliticize them and give them new meaning based on Western-centric ideas. So, he is very interested in the interactions between countries that have different power balances. And for him, that's the most important element. But I think we can also draw out a wider lesson about epistemology at large. Aaron Kuntz, who wrote a book called Responsible Methodologist, in other words, how can we be responsible and conduct research? What are the ethical implications? Writes that consumerist logics, in particular, he too is concerned with extractivism, have a decidedly negative effect on what research can do, and importantly, how we might come to know and be differently. So he also says this, which I think is extremely revealing, and I want to kind of build on in the next part. He says there is not much distance at all between how we live, how we claim to be, and how we come to know. In other words, the way in which we live forms the way in which we know, and the way in which we know also forms the way in which we live. So that's to do with our methodology if we're researchers, but also to do with wider social epistemology. So we can form some sort of an idea like this, that we have a way of knowing and we have a way of living, and these two things aren't really extricable. We are knowers without being livers, interactors. So in extractivism's case, ways of knowing, the kind of things that Grossvogel is talking about, the ways of knowing reaffirm the hierarchies that are implicit in the way of knowing, i.e. the going in and going, well, that's a good bit of knowledge, I'm going to incorporate it into this, what I consider to be superior aspect of knowledge without really talking to you, without understanding the full context. I'm going to decontextualize, depoliticize it, and use the bit that I want. That way of knowing creates knowledge that then also embeds those power hierarchies. Those power hierarchies are the knowledge about those power hierarchies. And again, if we go back to the extreme example of the global slave trade, then we can see that knowledge was created absolutely in dialogue with how we create power systems. The actions of people were based on a knowledge that said, well, there are these racial differences that mean that some people are below what the philosopher and sociologist, whose name I've forgotten now, a philosopher and sociologist whose name will come back to me in a second, calls the abyssal line. He says there's this dramatic line between what is human and therefore given rights and what is not. And so the construction of that line, in that case, is based on knowledge, and the way we live is based on how we construct that line. So how do we interrupt this circle? If we have a way of knowing that relies on the exploitation of resources, how do we come to interrupt it? Well, I'd say that's where the university actually comes in. What we can have in the university is the opportunity to create an institution that has the potential to think differently. And thinking differently is not just doing that thought and then going back to your lives. Thinking differently affects the way we act towards one another, the way we exist towards one another. This idea of human and nature separation being much more fluid, not really a useful concept, it's quite recent as a way of knowing. Before that, it was much more separated along what we might call these Cartesian lines of human and nature. The way we're knowing was interrupted, and I think can be interrupted by those locations of knowledge creation. So what I call the liminal university is a university situated on the peripheries of a certain set of social norms. If the way we live affects the way we act, then the way we form a university, and therefore the relations we create within it, will in itself construct the way knowledge is created in that university. So what we want to do is create a university where some of those norms are loosened, where the imperatives from society to act in particular ways, to take on certain values are loosened, and therefore there is space for experimental relationships between people. So different thinking requires not being in the mainstream. If we say a university has to be in the industrial mainstream, which is the prevalent logic and is continuing to be, it must be at the service of industry and it must be involved in sort of the capitalist functioning more and more, then actually we're placing the dominant societal logics into somewhere where they will compromise experimental ways of relating to one another. So to conclude, and hopefully we can, all of that very brief whiz through can come back in the questions, but to conclude, the university is in crisis. And it's a crisis that originates in the ways of thinking that came about in the Enlightenment. Our planet is also in crisis, and that is actually a linked crisis. It's not a separate crisis. They come from the same institutional logic that we've outlined here. And we can what we should be doing is looking for ways to facilitate alternative ways of relating to one another. So could we have a university that functions on some or all of these alternative ways of being? And could this constitute a more epistemically just knowledge base on which to run society? I'll wrap up there for fear of running way over time, but there are many more ideas. I should also say this bibliography was written when I read PowerPoints, which was a few weeks ago now. There are some things that I've talked about that aren't in here. If anyone's interested in anything, any specific references or anything, I do have a complete bibliography. You are more than welcome to. Thank you.
So we are now into the time for our next presentation. So obviously do a few questions and you'll be around, I presume, to catch up. Okay, so any questions for Matthew? I'm still taking it all in.
Talk about people being connected to nature, which I take the wrong way. But creation, there seems to be a drive for creation of communities, like say a 15-minute city, or those that separates people, restricts their movements and stops them interacting with nature.
Okay,
What do you think about that?
yeah, so my understanding of 15-minute city would not be at all that it is in any way restrictive. A 15-minute city, in theory, when some cities are already, it's not really as defined concept as I think it's been popularised as. But it should, in theory, allow you kind of access to everything, and in that should be included nature. So that's the important thing, that it's not about, again, not about separating humans and nature, but if you can design these things right, you're talking about giving people where they live all the things that they need in order to lead a good life. And that will include what some of the philosophers of extractivism talked about is actually that localism is really important to fostering the kind of collective responsibility that a response to environmental disasters needs. And so if you form a place that's formed around localism and the kind of local collective responsibility, then there is an argument to say that that could be an advantage for countering these ways of thinking we're talking about.
Question here. Sorry, Doug, yeah.
A lot of what you're saying seems to me is incorporated in feminist theory. So, you know, the idea of hierarchy, the idea of separation. So I think there are some encouraging things on the horizon. One is the rise of feminism in general in society. And secondly, and this is a little bit more specific, there's a parallel organization to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that I talked about, and that's one associated with biodiversity. And that panel has a specific requirement to look at indigenous knowledge. And so not only are they looking at the technologies and things that we in the Western world have developed, but they're also ensuring that whenever there's a decision to be made, that there's an indigenous component to that decision. It seems to me those are progress in the nature of creating your liminal university.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely, and you're right about the feminist angle. The global extractivist approach is one approach you can take to the critique of knowledge. A feminist approach would be the same, kind of approach that I think would lead to similar conclusions. On indigenous knowledge in biodiversity, yes, absolutely. There's a growing recognition, a growing way of knowing that's changing, which is that so much of the globe's biodiversity is under the custodianship of indigenous groups rather than in the custodianship of the government. And so the question then becomes, okay, why have we been trying to do all this in our specific way, in these industrial ways, when there are people doing this? And so what a philosopher of extractivism would probably say is, as long as it's done in a dialogical way, as long as it's done in conversation, rather than in, you're doing something, I'm gonna do that now, you can get out of the way, and I've got a company now, will now provide that ecosystem service, So as long as it's done the right way, absolutely, steps in the right direction.
I think we're only going to be able to take a couple more, sorry.
Where does artificial intelligence fit into all this?
How long did you say we had?
10 minutes ago. We
10 minutes ago.
But what you can do is talk in the break, if we get a break, because we're in danger of running into the afternoon. But yeah, you
Yes.
can talk after.
That is vast. I'm not sure I will even, I'm really sorry, I'm not sure I can even start to approach that topic right now.
It just seems to me that things are always forced upon us. We had glass before, back in the 60s for milk and everything. We didn't want plastic, we had to have it. everything seems to be forced.
Yeah, so
You were talking about nature before. I wondered if it was virtual nature in your 15-minute city or real nature.
well, what it would have to be real nature. The evidence doesn't show that. I don't think, as far as I'm aware, unless anyone knows differently, the research doesn't show there are similar benefits to virtual nature as real nature. So no, AI is a huge topic, and I would need to sit down with you maybe over several pints and work out how that fits into Liverpool University.
Sorry, definitely.
Yes, I suppose maybe I didn't fully understand what you said, but maybe if I did, at least from a maybe different perspective. I mean, you said early on that the purpose of universities was to primarily think differently, but you could approach that question in a different way. They uphold the existing social structures, they serve existing structures. So my question is, for the construction of this liminal university, is it possible within the current social system?
Brilliant question, yeah, because it's there is in the field of organisation institutionalism and new institutionalism, there is the agency paradox, which says, okay, well, all we're interested in is how things are formed by society, but then how do I make change in that society if everything is formed? Now, there are ways of getting around that particular paradox. I think the idea of the liminal university at its core is kind of a way of approaching that paradox. At least it's a way of asking the right question, I think, which is how do we create an area of society that is, and if I had time I would go into the theory of liminality, because it's a really interesting and extant area, and that's one fun, absolutely. And it's an existing area in loads and loads of cultures and in anthropology. This idea of liminality of areas of society that are in some way sealed from the social norms around them. So the question is, what features of that could contribute to an area of society in which thinking differently is not so closely linked to existing societal norms?
This is very quick. There is one example of a school operating in England called Somerset School, and you probably know about it, but that operates outside of the curriculum, and it is pretty much do what you like with the kids.
Yeah.
But it is a private school, you have to have parents put up a lot of money to put their kids there.
Again, it's a great thing that we can't go into, but one of the other scholars I was going to talk about writes a lot about that school as what she calls an everyday utopia, which is this kind of sealed off space where experimental living is allowed.
Can I suggest that any other questions with 10 minutes late now, pick up outside? Are you happy to do that? Yes?
Yeah. Very quick, it's up to you.
All right, very quick.
Just very quick. Patrick Moore, co-founder of Greenpeace, says that humanity is an intrinsic part of nature, and also he says there is no climate crisis, it's merely a reflection of elites that just want to make money out of causing a crisis, whether it be wars or energy. Why do you think he's saying that?
I can't speak for someone else's motivations, and again, I think several points would maybe help in the delving right into that one. I think crisis accurately describes the situation that we find ourselves in, a situation of pivotal uncertainty. I think that doesn't preclude a really rigorous and critical analysis of where those sources of power that cause that come from.
Thanks.